Consider a 17th century daybreak. A beleaguered city's walls are touched by the sun. From thousands of campfires, smoke rises. The meadows reverberate with the sound of drums. One of the biggest armies the world had ever seen assembled there, in front of Vienna's gates. 200,000 troops operating under the aegis of the Crescent, a three-continental empire whose military might had overrun all in its path for generations. But something occurred in September 1683, something that would permanently alter Europe's destiny. This is how the Battle of Vienna came to be. Today, you will learn about the complicated and sinister factors that contributed to the downfall of one of the most successful military operations in history. Please subscribe to the channel and let us know when you saw this video before we start this amazing trip through time. Let's check the number of historical adventurers present. We must travel back in time to comprehend what transpired that fateful September. We must comprehend the nature of the Ottoman Empire during the 17th century. Consider an empire that dominated the east-west trading routes, an empire that stretched across 3 continents. It ruled over North Africa to the south. The Sultan was in charge of the large swaths of the Middle East to the east. Additionally, the Balkans to the north had been subjugated, changed, and included under the Ottoman government. The Eastern Roman Empire's former capital, Constantinople, had collapsed in 1453. From that point on, the Ottomans were constantly out of the ordinary, glanced north, always toward the continent's Christian heartland, always toward Central Europe. However, the sword was not the only weapon used to build this kingdom. One of the most advanced governments of its era was established by the Ottomans, a kind of governance that interacted with various ethnic groups, faiths, and customs. Muslims, Jews, and Christians all had their own communities and laws, yet they all shared a common government. The millet system made religious autonomy possible. Additionally, the Ottoman army was a marvel of ingenuity and organization. The elite infantry of the empire, the Janissaries, were professionally trained from an early age. Ottoman artillery was regarded as the most sophisticated in the world, while Sipahi cavalry commanded enormous stretches of land. But the empire was at a turning point in its history in 1683. Its resources had been strained by decades of war. The economy had become unstable due to inflation brought in by the flow of silver from the Americas through Europe. Political tensions inside the country were rising, and trade routes were changing as Europeans found sea routes that completely avoided the Middle East. The Sultanate had gone through several strong and weak kings, and viziers and military leaders held a growing amount of influence. The Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, who would be the mastermind behind the Vienna campaign, steps in at this point. Kara Mustafa has a lot of ambition. Having come up through the Ottoman ranks via political savvy, calculated marriages, and, it must be acknowledged, a good measure of brutality when needed, he had held the office of governor in multiple provinces. After taking part in military engagements, he was appointed Grand Vizier in 1676, making him the second most powerful person in the empire, and the only one who reported to the Sultan. Kara Mustafa, however, had a problem. He required a win, a huge, spectacular triumph that would guarantee his legacy and cement his authority. Vienna had previously been targeted by the Ottoman Empire. The city had been under siege by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in 1529, but the siege was unsuccessful. Winter arrived, the Viennese fortifications held, and Suleiman had to flee. Ottoman history was nonetheless marked by that setback, which served as a warning that the empire's dominance had its limits. And now, over 150 years later, Kara Mustafa recognized a chance. Vienna was at risk. The division of the Holy Roman Empire occurred. Louis XIV's France was shifting European attention to the West.
The time was ideal. Kara Mustafa gathered a sizable force in 1683, which included soldiers from all throughout the empire, in addition to Ottoman soldiers, Crimean Tatars, Egyptian and Syrian soldiers, and warriors from Wallachia and Moldavia. Historical sources vary, but estimates place the overall number at 200,000 men. Under the Sultan's leadership, it was a multi-ethnic and multicultural force. And this massive war machine started to move north in March of that year. It was a spectacular march. The troops moved forward week after week, day after day. It traveled across the Balkans. The Danube was crossed. Panic swept through Central Europe with every stride. Cities gave up without a struggle. The gates of fortresses opened. After assessing their odds, a few local leaders concluded that siding with the Ottomans was preferable to resisting. So the troops came toward Vienna like an unstoppable tsunami. Let's now discuss Vienna. This was no typical city. One of the most significant cities in Europe, Vienna served as the capital of the Habsburgs and the seat of the Holy Roman Empire. But by 1683, its fortifications were outmoded. Centuries had passed since the fortifications were constructed. It was time to restore the bastions. There were probably only 10,000 regular soldiers in the military garrison. And additionally, terror swept across the populace upon hearing of the Ottoman advance. Emperor Leopold I made a choice that would draw harsh criticism. He ran away. He left Vienna and seized the archives, the nobles, and the imperial court. He put Count Ernst Rüdiger von Stahlenberg, a seasoned military leader with incredibly little funding, in charge of defending the city. Refugees from the countryside increased the city's population, which averaged about 50,000. Confusion, dread, and the frightening sense that a siege was imminent were all present. The siege of Vienna started when the Ottoman army arrived in July of 1683. Kara Mustafa set up a complex camp all across the city. It was more than just a camp for soldiers. It was a transitory city. Markets existed. Field mosques were present. Because Kara Mustafa carried personal comforts with him when he was at his most confident, there were even gardens. He was already celebrating in advance, since he was so sure he would win. The Ottoman plan was obvious: encircle the city entirely, shut off all supplies, and then start mining. Tunnels were excavated beneath the walls as part of the siege method known as mining. The Ottomans, who were experts in this method, then filled these tunnels with explosives and set them off, causing the defenses to collapse. Defenders could hear the sound of the underground diggers working day and night. It was terrible to the mind. As you stand on the wall guarding your city, you are aware that the ground under you could blow up at any time. In response, the defenders countermined. To find and destroy the Ottoman mines before they could be detonated, they dug their own tunnels. It was a violent underground conflict, waged with pickaxes and shovels in the dark. The walls trembled with frequent explosions. Each time the entire fortification collapsed, the defenders hurried to seal the openings. They stacked debris, they erected temporary barriers, and they put up a valiant fight to prevent the Ottomans from invading. Meanwhile, things got worse within the city. Food became scarcer, disease started to spread. There was no sense of security because water was being rationed and Ottoman artillery bombardments were continuous. Shells dropped at random, killing people in the streets and demolishing homes. There were rumors, always rumors, and morale was falling. There was hope, a shaky but genuine hope, despite the claims of others that no relief would arrive, that Europe had deserted Vienna, and that the city would soon fall. Emperor Leopold I had sent messages before his escape. He had sought assistance from other European rulers. Surprisingly, the response was favorable. One of the finest military leaders of his era, King Jan Sobieski of Poland, agreed to head a relief force. A coalition army gradually came into being as German princes assembled their men.
Here's an interesting fact regarding European politics in the 17th century. Europe was split all the time. German princes fighting among themselves, Protestants and Catholics, and France and the Habsburgs. The Ottoman menace, however, cut across these divisions, because everyone understood that nothing could stop the Ottomans from moving forward if Vienna fell and the heart of Central Europe was taken. Paris or Rome might follow. Thus, longtime adversaries turned into temporary allies. An extraordinary leader was Jan Sobieski. He had fought the Ottomans on the eastern borders of Poland for decades. He was aware of their strategy. He was aware of their advantages and disadvantages. Additionally, he brought experience, a valuable asset, with him when he assumed command of the relief army. Although the rescue army was small, roughly 70,000 men in total, it was a cohesive, driven, and skillfully led force that advanced rapidly into Vienna because they understood that every day mattered. Kara Mustafa, meanwhile, committed the first of many crucial errors. He didn't account for how quickly the rescue army could be there. He neglected his rear guard because he was too preoccupied with mining, and was sure that the walls would collapse any moment. He also didn't think they would get there in time when his scouts told him that a sizable army was on the way. He believed he had a few more days, maybe a week, to capture the city and break the siege. However, he was mistaken. The relief army arrived in the hills around Vienna on September 12, 1683, and they must have witnessed something both amazing and horrifying. The Ottoman camp was kilometers long, with hundreds of tents, smoke from innumerable fires, and a city in the middle that was still standing, but obviously on the brink of falling. The walls had fallen apart in places. Everywhere there were signs of fighting. Everyone understood that the time was running out. The following day would see the decisive battle. It was a difficult night on September 12th. To make plans, the coalition commanders convened. Considering that there were German princes and other nobles who could have held that position, Jan Sobieski's assumption of general authority was noteworthy. However, it was acknowledged by everybody that Sobieski had the most experience. It was a daring plan. In the morning, they would launch an attack, moving in a synchronized formation down from the hills. Kara Mustafa's camp would be the direct target of the Polish cavalry, which would lead the charge and include the well-known flying hussars. Here, special attention should be paid to the winged hussars. The backs of these elite horsemen's armor were adorned with wings. As they galloped, the wings, which were constructed of wood and cloth or eagle feathers, produced a frightful roar, a growl that frightened adversaries. They were the Polish cavalry's elite force, trained to launch devastating attacks, and they were ordered by Jan Sobieski himself. Kara Mustafa was likewise getting ready on the Ottoman side. However, this is where his leadership shortcomings start to show. He separated his troops. Because he still thought he could capture the city in combat, he kept a sizable section of the army concentrated on the siege. He did not focus all of his energies on fighting the relief army. Additionally, he arranged his forces so that it was challenging to react swiftly to attacks coming from multiple directions. The defensive arrangement was insufficient for the kind of fight that was going to take place. On top of that, there were command issues. Numerous units from different parts of the empire, each loyal to a different commander, made up the Ottoman army. Clear communication and undeniable authority were necessary to coordinate all of these elements. However, not all of Kara Mustafa's commanders held him in the highest regard, even if he was the Grand Vizier. Rivalries existed, jealousy was present, and in combat this would impact the army's unity. The fighting started when the sun rose on the morning of September 13. In waves, the relief force came down from the hills. First to strike, the German soldiers engaged the Ottoman trenches on the left flank.
Swords, muskets, and pike were used in vicious hand-to-hand combat. It must have been an overwhelming sound. The Germans continued to apply pressure, gradually driving the Ottoman lines back despite the oppressive stench of gunpowder and blood. Other coalition units moved forward in the middle, but the Ottomans held. After all, they were experienced fighters. For hours, the fate of the conflict remained uncertain despite the fact that they had fought dozens of battles. The lines moved forward and backward. The defenders on the wall in Vienna watched, barely believing that rescue was so close, as men fell and flags were exchanged. Then Jan Sobieski made his final move in the middle of the afternoon. Seeing that the Ottoman lines were being weakened on several fronts, he ordered the charge after holding the Polish cavalry in reserve to wait. Like an avalanche, 20,000 horsemen under the leadership of the winged hussars came tumbling down from the hills. The roar of hoofs and the sound of wings. It was a scene that everyone who saw it will remember forever. With devastating fury, the charge struck the Ottoman flank. The German infantry had already pressed the Turkish defenses, and they were unable to regroup in time. It collapsed after the Polish cavalry broke formation and the defenses were breached. The Ottoman troops started to flee. Although some made an effort to reorganize, the Polish charge's intensity and speed were too great. Then fear took over. Whole units started to escape. Chaos replaced order. Kara Mustafa made an effort to bring things under control. He issued directives. He called up reserves. However, it was too late. The conflict was lost, and he too ran away when it became evident that there was no way back. He left behind his paperwork, his possessions, and his opulent camp. The haste to get out left everything behind. Additionally, the relief force captured unfathomable wealth when they invaded the Ottoman camp. Weapons, flags, gold, jewelry, and yes, even the ornate tents and gardens of Kara Mustafa. The sacrifice was tremendous, but the victory was total. That day, thousands of soldiers lost their lives on both sides. The remains of Vienna were seen. They had survived, but buildings had been devastated, parts of the walls had collapsed, and it would take years for the city to fully rebuild. Vienna held out in the face of overwhelming odds. Let's now discuss the unclear causes of the Ottoman failure. For this was not merely a battle lost. It was the result of a string of tactical errors, poor leadership, and structural issues that were already undermining the Ottoman Empire from the inside out. First, the leadership issue. Despite his ambition, Kara Mustafa was blinded by it. He made irrational decisions because he was so consumed with capturing Vienna and ensuring his own glory. Offers of Vienna surrender that would have benefited the Ottomans were turned down by him. Some historians contend that because the treasure would be more beneficial to him personally, he preferred to thoroughly sack the city rather than accept it as a surrender. This avarice unnecessarily extended the siege. The second is the military intelligence problem. The potential and readiness of the Europeans to come together was totally underestimated by the Ottomans. They believed that any coordinated response would be thwarted by the political and religious differences in Europe. However, they disregarded fear.
a vital component. Europeans set aside their differences, if only momentarily, when confronted with existential threats. Furthermore, the Ottomans lacked backup plans to handle a relief army of that size and organization. Third, issues with logistics. Maintaining a 200,000-man army in combat for months is an enormous undertaking. There must always be food, drink, ammo, and horse feed available. Ottoman supply routes were convoluted, exposed, and long. These issues grew worse as the siege continued. Morale fell, horses perished, and soldiers starved. Fourth, the technology problem. Despite its impressiveness, Ottoman artillery was no longer as good as that of Europe as it had been centuries earlier.
In several ways, the Europeans had outperformed it after learning and adapting. Fortifications were changing. Despite being outnumbered, Vienna's defenders took advantage of the new developments as Italian-style bastions, with their angular designs intended to withstand cannon fire, became the norm. Internal divisions come in fifth. One of the Ottoman Empire's advantages and disadvantages was its size and diversity. Not every subject was pleased with Ottoman governance. There were resentments, there was opposition, and some of these tensions reached a peak during the campaign in Vienna. There was poor coordination between units from various regions. The efficacy of the army as a whole was weakened by commander rivalry. Sixth, and possibly most importantly, the Ottoman Empire stood at a watershed in its history. During the 17th century, the world underwent significant change. Emerging were new economic systems. Global trade was being altered by mercantile capitalism. Wealth that had traditionally flowed through the Middle East was being diverted by European-controlled sea routes, and the empire itself was struggling with social unrest, administrative corruption, and inflation. In a way, the capture of Vienna was an attempt to use invasion and looting to revive the empire, but it was unsuccessful. The fallout from the conflict was severe and immediate. In order to regroup, Kara Mustafa went to Belgrade. Sultan Mehmed IV, however, was incensed. It was not only a military defeat, it was embarrassing. Someone had to pay the price for the damage done to the empire's reputation. 3 months after the battle, in December 1683, Kara Mustafa was put to death by strangulation with a silk cord, as was customary for prominent Ottoman officials. All accolades were taken away from his body, and his name came to represent failure. However, the killing of Kara Mustafa did not address the underlying issues facing the empire. A protracted decline began with the Battle of Vienna. The Ottoman Empire lost Balkan lands in the ensuing years. The strategic initiative was permanently moved to Europe, and unfavorable treaties were concluded. The Ottomans would never again pose such a grave threat to the center of Europe as they did in 1683. The triumph was of great importance to Europe. It strengthened Habsburg authority. Vienna became a symbol of resistance, and the collaboration between the European nations, albeit transitory, highlighted what could be achieved when they worked together. Sobieski was hailed as heroes. The fight was the subject of poetry. The tale of the winged hussars' charge became legendary, and paintings were commissioned. Interesting cultural legacies are also present. Large amounts of coffee were reportedly found in the deserted Ottoman camp by the Viennese after the battle. The renowned coffee culture of Vienna is supposed to have sprung from this. This anecdote demonstrates how historical events are entwined with the city's cultural character, even if it is probably more mythology than fact. But let's take a broader view and see past the heroic stories. An important turning point in the history of European Middle Eastern relations was the Battle of Vienna. It signaled the end of the Ottoman Empire's dominance in the area and the start of a new period in which European nations would start to expand their influence both southward and eastward. This dynamic would worsen over the ensuing centuries, giving rise to wars that persist to this day, as well as colonialism and empire. It's also critical to take into account the story's many points of view. This story, which was popular at the time and has been supported over the centuries, was that Christianity had defeated Islam in the eyes of Europeans. However, it was a military setback in a protracted struggle for the Ottomans. After Vienna, the empire would endure for more than 200 years, changing, reforming, and even prospering during some of that time. It's not an easy story. It's not a story about right and wrong. It's multifaceted, subtle, and full of gray areas. Let's discuss a few of the unique individuals that contributed to the story's captivating appeal.
Although Leopold I, the fugitive emperor, received a lot of flack for his choice, supporters contend that he maintained the continuity of imperial power. The political turmoil may have been far worse if he had remained and been apprehended or executed. Making controversial choices for more important strategic reasons is sometimes necessary for leadership. The commander of Vienna's defense, Ernst Rüdiger von Starnberg, showed remarkable bravery. Against all odds, he kept the city intact for 2 months. The defenders were inspired by him. He oversaw wall restorations. He handled limited resources. And even when things appeared hopeless, he never gave up. In order for Vienna to survive long enough for assistance to come, his leadership was essential. Naturally, Jan Sobieski rose to prominence as history's greatest hero. However, it's noteworthy that his post-battle life was not as illustrious as one may have imagined. After his return to Poland, he struggled to establish his legacy and dealt with health issues and political intrigue. 13 years after his greatest triumph, he passed away in 1696. However, his name will always be remembered as Vienna's savior. Beyond Kara Mustafa, on the Ottoman side, there were thousands of regular troops whose tales are frequently overlooked. They covered thousands of miles while marching. Many of them lost their lives fighting for causes they might not have completely understood in harsh circumstances, distant from home, in a strange country. No matter whose side is involved, war is always a tragedy for people. Art and culture were also impacted by the Battle of Vienna. A surge of Baroque art was sparked by the triumph. As a token of gratitude for the city's salvation, churches were constructed or refurbished. And the battle's imagery, particularly the pictures of the flying husaros, inspired composers to write musical compositions honoring the occasion. Another intriguing element has to do with propaganda. The conflict served as propaganda for both the Ottoman and European sides. It was depicted by the Europeans as a triumph of civilization over savagery, which was obviously a grotesque and biased oversimplification. In certain internal documents, the Ottomans, for their part, minimized the loss, attributing it to the mistakes of a single commander rather than structural shortcomings. As always, the truth lies in the middle of these extreme stories. What lessons does the Battle of Vienna teach us today? The significance of leadership comes first. People in positions of authority can make decisions that have far-reaching effects. Kara Mustafa made decisions that ultimately led to catastrophe. Millions of people's lives were impacted by the decisions made by the Jan Sobieski that resulted in triumph. Second, despite the intricacy of global alliances, Europe was able to momentarily come together to confront a shared threat. However, rather than being founded on true friendship, these friendships were flimsy and motivated by practical objectives. Old rivalries reappeared as soon as the threat subsided. This serves as a reminder that although it is feasible, international cooperation necessitates ongoing work and shared commitment. The third is the perils of conceit and underestimating the adversary. Assuming victory, the Ottomans went into the campaign. They misjudged Europe's capacity to react and Vienna's resistance. They paid a heavy price for their conceit. It serves as a reminder to never assume victory before it has been attained. The significance of resilience comes in fourth. Despite overwhelming odds, the Vienna defenders persevered. They faced a strong foe, were outnumbered, and lacked supplies. They persisted, and this resiliency was entirely to do with this. Sometimes the secret to surviving is only to keep going. Fifth, historical events are interrelated. There was more to the Battle of Vienna that meets the eye. Centuries of war between Europe and the Ottoman Empire led to it. Global economic changes had an impact on it, and the subsequent centuries were shaped by its effects. Every event in history is woven into a tapestry with innumerable connections.
The what-ifs of history are likewise fascinating to think about. What if Vienna's capitulation had been accepted on favorable terms by Kara Mustafa? What would have happened if the relief force had shown up a week later? What if, rather than continuing the siege, the Ottomans had focused all of their resources on the attack? A different outcome and a totally different trajectory for European history could have resulted from any of these modifications. Religion is a topic that warrants critical thought. Many times, the Battle of Vienna is presented as a religious fight between Muslims and Christians. Indeed, religion was a factor in both sides' mobilization. However, it is oversimplified to attribute the conflict to religion alone. At stake were geographical, political, and economic interests. People of various faiths fought for complicated reasons on both sides, and there were alliances that transcended religious boundaries. Although it was not the only cause of the conflict, religion served as a mobilizing tool. Let's take a closer look at this battle's long-term effects. The European coalition continued its onslaught in the years immediately succeeding 1683. What started out as a last-ditch defense of Vienna evolved into a reconquest effort. Buda, the capital of Ottoman-occupied Hungary, was taken by imperial armies in 1684. Belgrade fell in 1687, and Ottoman territorial losses were ratified in 1699 by the Treaty of Karowitz. It represented the symbolic end of Ottoman expansion in Europe and was the first treaty that required the Ottomans to cede land. But let's go back to the battlefield on that September 13th afternoon. Consider the aftermath of the Polish cavalry attack. Complete chaos. Troops rushing in every direction. Men with injuries yelling for assistance. The foul stench of death. The winners, who were relieved but fatigued, started to take in what they had just accomplished. According to modern versions, Jan Sobieski wrote to the Pope to inform him that God had won, he had arrived, and he had seen. It was a gesture of religious humility, attributing the victory to divine providence rather than entirely to human merit. To paraphrase Julius Caesar's well-known statement, the defenders were finally able to breathe within Vienna. They had been living under continual stress for 2 months. They might have died every day. Every explosion had the potential to be the one that broke through the barriers and killed someone. There must have been a tremendous mix of relief, elation, and incredulity when the Ottoman army began to withdraw and the coalition colors began to fly. They were still alive. They had made it through despite everything. The city was in ruins, though. Historic structures were demolished. There had been thousands of fatalities. Ordinary citizens were also affected by the bombings and the diseases that proliferated during the siege. The trauma would be remembered for generations, and reconstruction would take years. The Battle of Vienna continues to shape the city's identity over 3 centuries later. The legacy of those awful times is preserved by monuments, museums, and annual remembrances. The psychological effects of the conflict on both sides should also be considered. Europeans viewed the victory as miraculous, particularly Catholics. Many honestly believed that the city had been preserved by divine intervention. There were religious processions. Across Europe, Thanksgiving masses were observed. Additionally, many people believed that the Virgin Mary had protected Vienna. In fact, September 13th, which is closely associated with the victory in Vienna, later evolved into a holy day feast day celebrating the holy name of Mary. The Ottomans were shocked by the defeat. They had dominated the military for ages in the area. They were victorious over Constantinople. They had ruled the eastern Mediterranean. After pushing their borders farther north, they were abruptly and decisively defeated. This led to a time of introspection and internal discussion. Some believed that the empire needed to modernize by implementing European strategies and technologies.
Others argued that a return to the old values that had made the empire great was imperative. Reforms would be tried, abandoned, and tried again during the decades-long debate. The 17th century saw a tremendous evolution in military technology. Historians refer to this as the military revolution, which was changing how wars were waged. Armies were becoming more permanent and professional. The battlefield was being dominated by infantrymen brandishing muskets. Fortifications were changing to withstand these new attacks, and artillery was becoming more precise and deadly. In this technical competition, the Ottoman Empire, which had been a military innovation in earlier ages, was starting to lag behind, and this lag was made clear by the loss at Vienna. There is a fascinating tale of a green flag, a holy standard that had belonged to Muhammad that was among the objects taken from the Ottoman camp. Tradition has it that this flag was eventually sent to the Pope in Rome as a trophy. It served as a potent symbol of victory for the Europeans. It was an immense embarrassment for the Ottomans. The significance of losing cultural and religious icons in combat was profound and beyond materiality. The collective soul was wounded. Let's discuss the particular strategies that changed the outcome of the conflict. With good reason, the Polish cavalry charge is frequently praised. However, a number of preceding elements were necessary for this charge to succeed. First, the Ottoman forces were unable to reorganize because the German soldiers had trapped them in situ. Second, the cavalry was favored by the terrain. The Poles gained pace and momentum on the descent thanks to the hills. Thirdly, the time was just right. Therefore, he held off on attacking until the Ottoman lines were completely committed. This tactical discipline and patience were essential. The Janissaries fought valiantly for the Ottoman side. Even as other units fled, these elite warriors remained in their positions. However, they were eventually overpowered and outnumbered. It was difficult for the Ottoman artillery, which had been so successful during the siege, to swiftly shift positions in order to counter the coalition's attack. The artillery's advantage was eliminated as the conflict devolved into a mobile and disorderly conflict because the cannons were heavy and challenging to move. The topic of what might have happened if Vienna had fallen is one of the most intriguing ones that historians discuss. What would have happened to the balance of power in Europe if Kara Mustafa had taken the city before the relief army arrived? The Ottomans would have probably strengthened their hold on Hungary and possibly moved westward. The political landscape of Europe may have been completely altered, and Germany might have been directly invaded. However, history, as we all know, does not operate with conjecture. We need to investigate the actual repercussions of what transpired. Communication, or the lack of it, played an important role. It was very difficult to organize massive armies in the days before the telegraph and radio. Horse messengers were the fastest mode of communication, but they still took days or even weeks to cross huge distances. As a result, commanders frequently used out-of-date information when making decisions. For instance, Kara Mustafa's planning was hampered by his lack of specific knowledge regarding the arrival time of the rescue force. During combat, the coalition force itself used visual cues like smoke and flags, as well as auditory cues like drums and trumpets to communicate. Although the technique was effective, it had clear drawbacks. Messages could easily be misunderstood or lost in the midst of the loud noise and the confusion of war, when gunpowder smoke obscured visibility. The fact that the coalition's commanders were able to maintain coordinated action demonstrates their skill. Motivation is an extremely fascinating topic. What drives soldiers to engage in combat? It was survival for Vienna's defenders. Their lives, their houses, and their families were on the line. The soldiers in the coalition are greatly motivated by this.
Loyalty to their lord, religious obligation, and possibly the prospect of loot were all factors. As part of their compensation, soldiers were frequently permitted to pillage the vanquished enemy during military operations during that era. Furthermore, the wealthy Ottoman camp undoubtedly gave the winners hefty prizes. The purpose might not have been as obvious to the Ottoman soldiers, particularly those who had traveled from far-flung parts of the empire. They were fighting in a strange country, far from home, for goals that might not have an immediate impact on their lives. Indeed, there was an obligation to the Sultan. The prospect of looting was present. Religious ideology was present. However, this motivation swiftly vanished as the struggle deteriorated, and it became evident that they were losing, and the outcome was a disaster. Following the battle, there have been allegations of violence and looting in the Ottoman camp and its environs. Unfortunately, this was typical of the wars of the era. When the war was won, the bloodshed continued. After being released from the discipline of combat, soldiers frequently committed horrible crimes, and after victory, individuals who had previously suffered during the siege frequently suffered more. It serves as a sobering reminder that suffering always results from war, even when it is right. The post-siege restoration of Vienna was impressive. In addition to fixing the damage, the city took advantage of the occasion to change. In the Baroque style, new structures were built. As the walls were strengthened and updated, Vienna started to develop into the magnificent imperial metropolis that it is today. The years following the conflict saw the construction or expansion of some of the city's most recognizable structures, including portions of Schönbrunn Palace. The city seemed to be reaffirming that it had not only made it through, but was flourishing. The development of national identities was also impacted by the conflict. It became a pivotal moment of Polish national grandeur. It was the occasion that cemented Vienna's position as the Habsburg capital. It served as an example of German cooperation for the several participating German states. And throughout the ages, these stories were created and recreated, occasionally warped to suit subsequent political objectives. Not always truthfully or responsibly, nationalists from a variety of countries adopted the Battle of Vienna as a symbol in the 19th and 20th centuries. Real history and the myths that have developed around it must be distinguished. There are accounts, for instance, claiming 300,000 Turks were present, or that only 100,000 fought. The figures differ significantly according on the source. Most likely, the truth is somewhere in the middle. However, we must acknowledge that historical texts from that era sometimes inflated figures for dramatic effect. It takes thorough examination of several sources and knowledge of the historical setting in which they were written to distinguish fact from fiction. The involvement of women throughout the siege is another intriguing element. Women of Vienna played important roles, but they are rarely acknowledged in conventional histories. They took care of the injured. They assisted in moving supplies and weapons. At times when the men were worn out, some even helped to defend the walls. And in the face of impossibility, they managed to keep civilian life going as smoothly as possible. These contributions are often overlooked in traditional military history, yet they are essential to a thorough comprehension of the conflict. And there's the prisoner issue. Both sides took prisoners during and after the siege. These inmates received a wide range of treatment. Sadly, some were put to death or sold into slavery, while others were traded or kept for ransom. Warfare in the 17th century did not adhere to the humane norms that, in theory, regulate modern wars. It was ruthless and cruel. The pre- and post-battle diplomacy is a tale unto itself. Throughout the siege, messengers moved between Vienna and the Ottoman camp. Ultimatums were given, threats were made, and offers were made.
As previously stated, Kara Mustafa turned down capitulation terms that could have been advantageous. He desired complete and unreserved surrender. This lack of flexibility in diplomacy was a strategic error. Accepting half of what you want is sometimes preferable to risks losing all in politics and war. Diplomacy throughout Europe grew more intense after the conflict. The issue of how to partition the reclaimed areas arose. Rivalries existed among the allies who had fought alongside one another, and an armistice or permanent peace with the Ottoman Empire was required. The conclusion of these difficult discussions took years. The ultimate outcome was the Karlowitz Treaty, which was previously discussed, but the path to get there was a torturous one. It's also critical to take into account the unique experiences of regular soldiers. Not the famous leaders whose names we are familiar with, but the thousands of men whose names history has forgotten. Imagine being drafted into the Sobieski's army as a Polish peasant. It may be the first time in your life that you leave your village. After weeks of marching over strange terrain, you find yourself in the midst of the most epic fight you have ever witnessed, rushing downward in the direction of an enemy army. It must have been crippling fear, but you continue because your commander told you to, because there is no other option, and because your fellow soldiers continue. And you live with memories of that day for the rest of your life, if you make it through. Or picture yourself working as an Ottoman janissary. You spent years serving the empire after being enlisted at an early age and undergoing rigorous training. You participated in earlier campaigns. You take pride in your abilities and your unit. Then you see it all fall apart in Vienna. You have broken lines. As your allies run away, you must decide what to do. Either stay and most likely die, or run away and try to live. In battle, there are no simple decisions. Many of these instances were depicted in the art of the era, albeit frequently in a romanticized and heroic manner. Jan Sobieski is shown in combat paintings as a near-divine character who shines in golden armor. They portray the Ottomans as a chaotic mob and the winged hussars as vengeful angels. Despite their potency, these pictures are propaganda. They were produced for the sake of celebration, justification, and inspiration. Compared to these drawings, the actual combat was far bloodier, dirtier, and more unclear. There was also music. There are pieces from the era that celebrate triumph.
And it's interesting to note that European artists were influenced by Ottoman military music, which has distinctive drums and cymbals. The cultural interest that persisted long after the military battle ended was reflected in the eventual incorporation of Turkish aspects into the works of Mozart, Beethoven, and others. Let's consider what war actually is. Weapons used in the Battle of Vienna included swords, spears, muskets, and cannons. Death was visceral and intimate. Neither guided missiles nor airstrikes were used. The face of the assailant was visible to you. Furthermore, this kind of combat was psychologically damaging even though it was technologically archaic by today's standards. The soldiers that made it out alive most certainly had what is now known as post-traumatic stress disorder. The logistics of medieval and early modern warfare were a discipline unto itself, despite the lack of a term or treatment at the time. Every day, each soldier had to consume almost half a kilogram of food. More forage was needed by each horse than by a human. The magnitude of the problem becomes apparent when you multiply this by tens of thousands. Because they had to requisition food and supplies from the local population, large armies frequently destroyed the areas they went through, causing great suffering to populations on both sides. One should not underestimate the role of illness. In pre-modern warfare, illness typically claimed the lives of more men than combat injuries. Both the besiegers and the besieged contracted typhus, dysentery, and other illnesses during the siege of Vienna. The state of hygiene was archaic. There was a lack of medical knowledge, and sickness spreads quickly in congested areas with thousands of people. In addition to the weather being important, this made both armies weaker during the siege. It was the height of summer when the siege started in July. Conditions were made considerably more challenging by the heat. Additionally, people became more aware of the impending winter as September drew near. Military operations in Central Europe were quite challenging. Roads became impassable in the winter. Soldiers suffered from the cold and supplies froze. Sobieski and Kara Mustafa both knew of their little window of opportunity. Every day that passed without Kara Mustafa capturing the city made failure more likely. It was important for Sobieski to get there before winter. Additionally, there is a significant economic component. The cost of war was high. Large army mobilization and maintenance came at an enormous cost. The Habsburgs incurred significant debt in order to protect Vienna.
To fund the campaign, the Ottomans depleted the imperial treasury. Additionally, there were serious economic repercussions when the effort failed. The Ottoman Empire was in danger of going bankrupt. The need to increase taxes led to civil unrest, which made the empire's issues even more complex. However, the Vienna win created economic opportunities for Europe. Reclaimed Ottoman territories could be developed and populated. It was possible to restore trade routes that had been interrupted. And then there were the war booty, which, although morally dubious, gave the winners substantial resources. Let's also think about the battle's effects on the environment, which are rarely acknowledged. Tens of thousands of horses and 200,000 men camped for months, destroying the surrounding area of Vienna. For building materials and firewood, forests were cleared. They tramped on fields. Streams and rivers were contaminated. Additionally, hundreds of remains had to be burned or buried following the conflict. Years passed before the landscape recovered. It's amazing how historical memory can be preserved. Over the ages, the Battle of Vienna's legacy has evolved. It was new, vibrant, and agonizing in the instant after. It had become a legend a century later. It was history 2 centuries later. And over 3 centuries later, it is still researched by academics, taught in schools, and remembered in Poland and Vienna. However, every period views the conflict through its own prisms, issues, and biases. The fight was reframed as a victory of national spirit amid the height of European nationalism in the 19th century. Following 2 catastrophic global wars in the 20th century, it came to represent both bravery and the pointlessness of conflict. And in today's globalized world, we can reflect on it as a turning point that influenced centuries of European Middle Eastern engagement and a significant milestone in the history of cross-cultural connections. It is now time for introspection as this historical adventure draws to a close. We learn about the vulnerability of empires from the Battle of Vienna. It instructs us on the value of sound judgment and leadership. It teaches us about bravery, fortitude, and the selflessness of common people in remarkable circumstances. As we acquire greater insight throughout time, it also teaches us that history is complex, multifaceted, and always subject to fresh interpretations. There were several interrelated and obscure reasons why the Ottomans were unable to destroy Vienna. It wasn't simply a battle lost. It was the result of serious structural issues, poor strategic choices, conceit and underestimate of the enemy, and more significant historical changes that were altering the balance of power in the world. Although it started its long, gradual downfall there, the Ottoman Empire did not fall in 1683. And Europe, which had shuddered in the face of Ottoman danger, started to ascend to the world dominance that would define the centuries that followed. Above all, though, we must keep in mind that this was a human story about actual individuals who experienced remarkable events and had hopes and anxieties. Of warriors who fought and lost their lives, of leaders whose choices altered the course of history, of families ripped from one another, of cultures that clashed, sometimes violently, and sometimes leading to unexpected exchanges of ideas and traditions, of cities that were destroyed and rebuilt. The best instructor we have is history. It demonstrates to us the possibilities of tragedy and glory. Even in the face of strife, it serves as a reminder of our common humanity. Additionally, it pushes us to develop a better future by learning from the past. In all its epic complexity, the Battle of Vienna provides insight into a crucial period in human history. Studying it also helps us understand ourselves, our civilizations, and the enduring challenges of human life. In addition to teaching us about the past, may we never forget what history has taught us. May we respect the people who came before us in all their good and bad qualities. And may we apply this understanding to face the challenges of our own era with courage, compassion, and wisdom. This was how the Battle of Vienna unfolded, a time when destiny was on the line. It was a moment that altered the course of history and that is still felt today, decades later. It is crucial to acknowledge that all of history, human wisdom, and the information we seek are gifts given to us as we come to the end of this epic saga. We are fortunate to be able to reflect on the past, draw lessons from it, and impart these knowledges to future generations. I thank the Lord God for providing us with this rich tapestry of human experience and for enabling us to use history as a means of introspection, education, and personal development. May He always light our way as we pursue knowledge and insight. May we always draw on the lessons learned from the past to create a future where all peoples live in harmony, respect, and understanding. God bless our research, our contemplations, and our continuous quest for knowledge.